everyone. Welcome back to the Poetryphobia series. It's been a while since our previous installment, but here we are again. And this time we will talk about poems and politics. I know. If there's one thing we fear more than poetry, it's politics. So how are you combining this? Why are you doing this to us? Well, my short answer is that, like poetry, politics should be everyone's business. Otherwise, we leave it to the politicians. And we all know how that's going. This time, I want to spend less time on theory and more time reading poetry. So let's get that theory out of the way. I want to discuss very briefly poetry as rhetoric. Rhetoric, as you may know, is the art of persuasion, the art of putting arguments in a compelling form to sway minds, to convince people of things, or to drive people into action or into changing their mind. I want to suggest to you the idea that most poems want to persuade. In fact, this was one of the concerns the ancient philosopher Plato had in mind when he considered poets dangerous and poetry dangerous, and when he imagined his perfect society, his perfect republic in the philosophical dialogue known as the Republic, he excluded the poets. In his ideal society, there is no room for poets. And that is not because he does not care for poetry. He himself is very fond of poetry, sees its value, quotes it in his philosophical writings. He just thinks it's too dangerous because of its rhetorical power, because it can corrupt the youth, corrupt the citizens, the would-be citizens that his ideal society would like to create. Among other things, because poetry contains fancy. Poetry can describe the gods doing things that are perhaps ungodly and thus set a bad example. So Plato was worried about poetry's rhetorical power. I want to suggest to you that even a brief impressionist poem that only seems to try to capture a mood or express a nature scene, even haiku, may want to persuade us of something, if only of that impression, right? It wants to persuade us that the cherry blossom really was that way, or really did, was juxtaposed with, I don't know, the frog croak in that particular way. So there is an act of persuasion in poetry, even when the poem does not overtly try to sell you an opinion. It is still trying to persuade you of the poetic sentiment and the poetic act, communication act, that it is engaging in. Now, political poems will want to persuade us of the value, negative or positive, of certain political positions or acts, that something is good, desirable, or bad, damaging, undesirable, or at least to encourage us to develop a political position about the situation, right? A political poem may also just describe a situation, inviting us to form a positive or negative position or response about it, even without telling us what to think. Now, what is political? Without philosophizing too much, literally, of course, it is all relating to politics, and politics are either just the art of government, or a more expansive definition from Merriam-Webster, the total complex of relations between people living in society. In society is the key. If you're a hermit, there's relatively little politics you need to worry about. But the moment you're in society, the total complex of relations, it's far beyond voting and parties, right? The total complex of relations between you and the rest of society, the norms, the rules, the punishments for breaking the rules, these are all political questions. The opportunities, these are all political questions. I hope that is clear enough. I would like to include in political, for the purposes of this talk, also the moral positions regarding the above topics, right? So your own position about how should that total complex of relations run itself? What should be the rules, right? And even more broadly, the human condition and the imperatives derived from it. That for some people would not be political. I would like to suggest that certain kinds of political poetry take the human condition, describe an aspect of the human condition, and pose it as a political issue, as a challenge to how we form and structure our societies, given the human condition. So, I'll conclude the brief theoretical part by quoting a poet we will hear from later. Auden wrote, "Poetry is not concerned with telling people what to do, but with extending our knowledge of good and evil, perhaps making the necessity for action more urgent and its nature more clear." So this is Auden, a very political poet, talking about poetry's role and maybe making the distinction for poetry, or for good poetry, don't just tell people what to do, help them see and increase their moral range, increase their moral perception, so that they have a better knowledge of good and evil, which will maybe drive them to action or drive them to form opinions. But don't, so he's advocating a more indirect form of political speech within poetry. All right, let's read some political poetry. That was brief, right? Wait, no Greeks this time? Well, if you insist, of course we can have some Greeks. So this is an old friend. Those of you who have watched the first installment will remember our old pal Theognis of Megara. His best friend, a young man named Kyrnos, was the subject of the poem we read back then, when he was complaining about how Kyrnos is not giving him any attention, etc. This is from the same collection of poetry to Kyrnos. Remember, Theognis was a nobleman of ancient Megara. We're talking like 2,600 years ago. And he was trying to educate young Kyrnos. He was trying to give him the benefit of his wisdom. And I chose two segments of his advice to Kyrnos. The music, the meter, is lost in translation, unfortunately, but in Greek, these are metrical lines. He says, "Kyrnos, this city is in travail, and I fear she may give birth to a corrector of our evil pride. For though her citizens are still discreet," meaning decent or honest here, "their guides are heading for much mischief." So he's just instilling a general foreboding in Kyrnos, and it offers the interesting idea: the people are okay, it's the leaders that are rotten, which may be a familiar sentiment. Another section says, "Never yet, Kyrnos, have good men ruined a city. But when it pleases the bad to do the works of pride and corrupt the common folk, and give judgment for the unrighteous for the sake of private gain and power," this may also be familiar, "then expect not that city to be long quiet, for all she be now in great tranquility. Aye, then when these things become dear to the bad, to wit, gains that bring with them public ill, For of such come discords and internecine slaughter, and of such come tyrants, which things, I pray, may never please this city. The city that they're in, which of course is city-state, right? It's a political entity on its own. So Theognis, again, is really worried about kids these days, right? And how things are going. He's also worried about bad people and greed being motivators of ruling men. It is men, of course, in those times. Moving on to another Greek, a more unintentionally amusing one, Xenophanes of Colophon. He's one of the pre-Socratic philosophers, and he made some very stark observations. He says, "But mortals deem that the gods are begotten as they are, and have clothes like theirs, and voice, and form." Xenophanes thinks it is ridiculous. He says, yes, and if oxen and horses or lions had hands and could paint with their hands and produce works of art, as men do, horses would paint the forms of the gods like horses, and oxen like oxen, and make their bodies in the image of their several kinds. Pretty sharp observation from a pre-Socratic philosopher. This may sound like the first atheist. It is not. Xenophanes is devout, but he goes against what he considers the vulgar depiction of gods. He means the depiction we see in Homer, for example, right? Of gods as essentially super powerful, human-shaped, human-like beings with greed and lust and treachery and all the things we know from human nature. Xenophanes considers this unseemly and untrue. And he makes the point that we're only imagining the gods, the Olympian gods, to be this way because, well, we are this way. If we were oxen, we would imagine them to be oxen. Right? Oh, sorry, I missed the third example. The Ethiopians make their gods black and snub-nosed. The Thracians say theirs have blue eyes and red hair. So that's Xenophanes' comment on the way humans copy their politics, their societies, and project those notions onto things they don't know, can't know, and shouldn't project about. And finally, no more Greeks, I promise. Eskolion. Eskolion is a Greek drinking song. It is a song designed and performed and sung at feasts, symposia, right? So when Greek men, of course, would get together and drink, they would drink wine, watered down, of course. It is barbaric to drink undiluted wine. That allows you to drink more of it, of course. They would sit around, drink wine, philosophize, and exchange poetry, including songs like these. They don't have an identified author. They're just folk songs, if you will. Now, Harmodius and Aristogaton are two Greek young men who did the brave act of killing the tyrant Hipparchus, or Hipparchos, the Greek tyrant of the day in the 6th century and BC. And so these are songs of praise, praising their example, their civic example. In myrtles veiled will I the falchion wear, for thus the patriot sword Harmodius and Aristogiton bear, when they the tyrant's bosom gored, and bade the men of Athens be regenerate in equality, right, to restore equality. O beloved Harmodius, never shall death be thine who livest forever. Thy shade, as men have told, inherits the islands of the blessed spirits, where deathless live the glorious dead, Achilles, fleet of foot, and Diomed, two of the great heroes of the Iliad. So this historical person is compared to the mythical heroes of the Iliad for their act of killing the tyrant. In myrtles veiled will I the falchion wear, for thus the patriot's sword Harmodius and Aristogiton bear when they the tyrant's bosom gored, when in Minerva's festal rite they closed Hipparchus's eyes in night. Right? They killed him during the festival, Athena's festival, here translated in typical 19th century fashion using the Latin name, the Roman name Minerva. Harmodius's praise, Aristogiton's name, shall bloom on earth with undecaying fame, who with the myrtle-wreathed sword the tyrant's bosom gored, and bade the men of Athens be regenerate in equality. This is a political poem in that it holds up an example of an act, a pretty extreme act, an act of murder, as a civic virtue, because it's the murder of a tyrant. And it is promising eternal praise for these two young men, and here we are contributing to their fame by mentioning them because of their act, and it sets it out as the example to follow. It is essentially saying this was the right and noble act. All right, elegantly skipping ahead 2,500 years, we arrive to the early 19th century with English poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. Shelley was a brilliant young poet, died tragically young. And before we read his poem, you need a bit of background, because I'm assuming not all of you are familiar with the story of Peterloo. So in 1819, England being post the Napoleonic Wars, the north of England is extremely poor and suffering from famine and hopelessness. And the textile industry, once the pride of Britain, is hit particularly hard. The weavers are absolutely desperate. No help is coming from the crown, and to make things worse, the landowners, the rich people of England, are getting parliament, which they completely control in the early 19th century because of the way the franchise, right, the way the vote works in early 19th century England. They get the parliament to institute corn laws, which are essentially guarantees that people have to buy corn, meaning grain, locally. They have to buy the grain that is produced there. So you cannot import cheap grain. You have to buy the grain that your lord or the local potentate is making available at their price, which of course helps the landowners make a profit in these desperate times. This pressure and the corn laws, which by being enacted show not only no help is coming, but the powers that be don't care and make it harder for us, cause a lot of unrest. And in an open field, in a croft in Manchester called St. Peter's Field, they organize a political rally, a huge political rally. 10,000 people in the early 19th century is absolutely huge, to listen to a reformer named Henry Hunt speak. And he's basically delivering a political speech about the change that needs to happen against the corn laws, etc., etc. The city magistrates, the city government of Manchester, is very upset about this, worried about this, and is pressured by landowners and gentry to put a stop to this. This rabble rousing is too dangerous. And since they have a garrison, a small garrison of soldiers in the city, in Manchester, they summon them to disperse the rally and to arrest this troublemaker Hunt. The cavalry does what the cavalry does, which is charge! And they charge, swords drawn, into the crowd, predictably causing deaths and wounding hundreds in the resulting turmoil. Now, this may not seem like that big of a disaster. I mean, 15 to 19 people were killed, several hundreds wounded. I mean, we read of things of this magnitude practically every day these days. In a sense, those were more civilized times, because this caused a huge shock in England. The fact the government sent cavalry to attack innocent, unarmed attendees, not even protesters, attendees of a speech, of a political rally, was shocking and horrible. Newspapers were beginning to become a force to be reckoned with in the early 19th century, which led to this being spread, the news being spread, people finding out about it, which caused a problem. And so on the backdrop of this event, which came to be called Peterloo, as an allusion to Waterloo, right, the Battle of Waterloo, in terms of the tragic losses, right? So it's not the name of a place, it's just St. Peter's Field, right, plus the allusion to Waterloo. The Peterloo Massacre is the backdrop to the following poem by Shelley. It's a very long poem, and I have taken the unforgivable liberty of abridging it to include it in this talk. So it starts with the poet, Shelley, right, the speaker in the poem, seeing a vision. And the vision is of murder and death roaming the land. And the murder and death in his vision, he realizes, are actually masks. And behind the masks are politicians of the day, which he names, right? So he names in the poem the politicians of the day. That's less relevant for us. And we catch up with the poem here. It's fairly easy to follow, so I'll just read it without a lot of commentary. Last came Anarchy. He rode on a white horse splashed with blood. He was pale even to the lips, like death in the apocalypse. And he wore a kingly crown, and in his grasp a scepter shone. On his brow this mark I saw, I am God and King and Law. With a pace stately and fast, over English land he passed, trampling to a mire of blood the adoring multitude. For with pomp to meet him came, clothed in arms like blood and flame, the hired murderers who did sing, Thou art God and Law and King. We have waited weak and lone for thy coming, mighty one. Our purses are empty, our swords are cold. Give us glory and blood and gold. Right, he's talking about soldiers, how they welcomed the action. Lawyers and priests, a motley crowd, to the earth their pale brows bowed, like a bad prayer not over loud, whispering, Thou art law and God. And then I'm skipping a few verses. Hope appears, and anarchy, the terrible figure from before, flees. And then hope, right, the embodiment of hope, delivers a speech. And hope says, Men of England, heirs of glory, heroes of unwritten story, nurslings of one mighty mother, hopes of her and one another. Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. What is freedom? Ye can tell that which slavery is too well, for its very name has grown to an echo of your own. And now Hope proceeds to describe some of the conditions. 'Tis to work and have such pay as just keeps life from day to day, in your limbs as in a cell, for the tyrant's use to dwell. So that ye for them are made, loom and plough and sword and spade, with or without your own will bent to their defense and nourishment. 'Tis to see your children weak, with their mothers pine and peak, when the winter's winds are bleak, they are dying whilst I speak. I skip a little. And at length when ye complain, with a murmur weak and vain, 'tis to see the tyrant's crew ride over your wives and you. Blood is on the grass like dew. Birds find rest in narrow nest, when weary of their winged quest. Beasts find fare in woody lair, when storm and snow are in the air. Asses, swine have litter spread, and with fitting food are fed. All things have a home but one. Thou, O Englishman, hast none. This is slavery. Savage men or wild beasts within a den would endure not as ye do. but such ills they never knew. So the poet is spending some time to convince his hearers, and this was designed to be read to the illiterate, right? Most people cannot read this poem, but it was designed to be shared and read to the illiterate, and the poet is spending time trying to convince people of how bad they have it, and remind them that even beasts have, a better lot than some of them, and that savage people wouldn't put up with the conditions that they do put up with. So he was describing what is slavery. Now hope, the poet through hope is describing freedom. What art thou, freedom? Oh, could slaves answer from their living graves this demand, tyrants would flee like a dream's dim imagery. Thou art not, as impostors say, a shadow soon to pass away, a superstition and a name echoing from the cave of fame. The poet is dismissing the idea that freedom is a phantom that is not worth pursuing. For the laborer thou art bread, and a comely table spread, from his daily labor come, in a neat and happy home. Thou art clothes, and fire, and food, for the trampled multitude. No, in countries that are free, such starvation cannot be, as in England now we see. Skipping a bit. Thou art justice, ne'er for gold, may thy righteous laws be sold, as laws are in England. Thou shieldst alike the high and low. Thou art wisdom, free men never dream that God will damn forever all who think those things untrue, of which priests make such ado. A little note of irreligion there. Thou art peace, never by thee would blood and treasure wasted be, as tyrants wasted them, when all leagued to quench thy flame in gall. Science, poetry, and thought are thy lamps, right? Freedom's lamps. They make the lot of the dwellers in a cot so serene they curse it not. Let a great assembly be of the fearless and the free, on some spot of English ground where the plains stretch wide around. Let the blue sky overhead, the green earth on which ye tread, all that must eternal be, witness the solemnity. From the corners uttermost of the bounds of English coast, from every hut, village, and town, where those who live and suffer moan, from the workhouse and the prison, where pale as corpses newly risen, women, children, young and old, groan for pain and weep for cold, from the haunts of daily life, where is waged the daily strife, with common wants and common cares, which sows the human heart with tears. Lastly, from the palaces, where the murmur of distress echoes like a distant sound of a wind alive around, those prison halls of wealth and fashion, where some few feel such compassion for those who groan and toil and wail, as must make their brethren pale. Note that he's mentioning that some people up high get it. Ye who suffer woes untold, or to feel or to behold, your lost country bought and sold, familiar phrase, with a price of blood and gold, let a vast assembly be, and with great solemnity declare with measured words that ye are, as God has made ye, free. Be your strong and simple words keen to wound as sharpened swords, and wide as targes let them be. Targes are shields. Wide as targes let them be, with their shade to cover ye. Let the tyrants pour around with a quick and startling sound, like the loosening of a sea, troops of armed emblazonry. Let the charged artillery drive till the dead air seems alive, with the clash of clanging wheels and the tramp of horses' heels. Let the fixed bayonet gleam with sharp desire to whet its bright point in English blood, looking keen as one for food. Let the horsemen's scimitars wheel and flash like fearless stars, thirsting to eclipse their burning in a sea of death and mourning. Stand ye calm and resolute, like a forest close and mute, with folded arms and looks which are weapons of unvanquished war. He's essentially reimagining Peterloo, right? And encouraging the workers, the people, to stand unarmed, but with folded arms, and looks which are weapons of unvanquished war. And if then the tyrants dare, let them ride among you there, slash and stab and maim and hew what they like, that let them do. With folded arms and steady eyes and little fear and less surprise, look upon them as they slay, till their rage has died away. Then they will return with shame to the place from which they came, and the blood thus shed will speak in hot blushes on their cheek. Every woman in the land will point at them as they stand. They will hardly dare to greet their acquaintance in the street, and the bold true warriors who have hugged danger in wars will turn to those who would be free, ashamed of such base company. And that slaughter to the nation shall steam up like inspiration, eloquent, oracular, a volcano heard afar. And these words shall then become like oppression's thundered doom, ringing through each heart and brain, heard again, again, again. Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. So, I don't think this requires too much explication, but it's a striking poem, I think, including Romanticism and Enlightenment, right? Preaching for science, for liberty, for freedom, for dignity. Also preaching nonviolence, right? It's a pretty striking scene that he's describing. Yes, let them kill, and the shame will be on them. You know, we are nonviolent. There are anticipations here of ideas of nonviolent struggle that we see later in the 20th century. There are some words here that are reminiscent of things like the Communist Manifesto, right? Shake your chains and all that. And the basic idea, the strong socialist or revolutionary idea, ye are many, they are few. All right, any comments or questions before we move on? Give a second for people on the Hangout. Okay. So, moving on to Germany. A near contemporary, Heinrich Heine. There's actually a very similar situation in Germany following the Napoleonic Wars, and the weavers, again, are in the thick of it. And Heine wrote a famous poem that I will bring in English, translated by Sasha Foreman, called The Silesian Weavers. Silesia, right, is a Saxony, and it goes like this. Their gloom-enveloped eyes are tearless. They sit at the spinning wheel, snarling, cheerless. Germany, we weave your funeral shroud. A threefold curse be within it endowed. We're weaving, we're weaving. A curse on God, to whom we knelt when hunger and winter's cold we felt, to whom we flocked in vain and cried, who mocked us and poxed us and cast us aside. We're weaving, we're weaving. A curse on the king, remember there are three. A curse on the king, the wealthy men's chief, who was not moved even by our grief, who wrenched the last coin from our hand of need and shot us, screaming like dogs in the street. We're weaving, we're weaving. A curse on this lying father nation, where thrive only shame and degradation, where every flower's plucked ere its bloom, and worms thrive in the dank rot and gloom. We're weaving, we're weaving. Oh, shuttle, fly. Shuttle is the small thing in the loom, right? Oh, shuttle, fly, loom, crank away. We weave unfailing night and day. Old Germany, we weave your funeral shroud. A threefold curse be within it endowed. We're weaving, we're weaving. This became a really popular poem among students and representatives of New Germany. New Germany was an actual movement Heine was a part of, rejecting basically the old Germany, right? The old regime, the old ways, the feudal ways, and demanding things like liberty, freedom of the press, etc. So I brought this. There's not much more to say about this, just to show you similar sentiments with similar circumstances expressed in two different languages, two different cultures, towards a similar end. And hopping back to England and a little forward in time, we come to Wilfred Owen, a British poet who fought and died in World War I, tragically, I think a week or two before the armistice, which is just terrible. He was a wonderful poet, and so this is the context, right? World War I don't think I need to say much about the historical context of World War I, but this is what Wilfred Owen has to say about it. He offers us a parable, like Jesus' parables, a parable of the old man and the young. And this, of course, alludes to a story from Genesis, the binding of Isaac. So Abram rose and clave the wood and went and took the fire with him and a knife. And as they sojourned both of them together, Isaac the firstborn spake and said, My father, behold the preparations, fire and iron, but where the lamb for this burnt offering? Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth the knife to slay his son. So far, just a retelling of the binding of Isaac, well, except for the line about builded parapets and trenches there, which of course transposes the whole scene from Mount Moriah to World War I. But then what happens? In the biblical story, as we remember, just as Abraham is ready to show his faith and slay his son, an angel cries out, do not lay your hand on the boy. There is a ram in the thicket. Sacrifice the ram instead, etc., etc., right? That's what happens in the Bible. However, Owen says, when lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. This is what Wilfred Owen is offering us as a parable. The message is clear enough. He's aiming it at the powers that be, the people who decided to go to war rather than pursue other avenues. And he considered, of course, there are, the World War I is involved with all the military alliances and guarantees given by the European powers. Owen has no time for that. He calls all of that the ram of pride. And that's what should have been sacrificed instead of half the seed of Europe, one by one. He knows what he's talking about, because here's a more visceral demonstration of what he has seen. Before we read it, the title, Dulce et decorum est, in Latin, is the familiar beginning of a quotation from Horace, the poet Horatius. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for the fatherland. Perhaps in English we would say motherland, but in Latin, fatherland. Right, so that is the kind of the standard patriotic idea. It is sweet and fitting. It is glorious to give your life for your country. Wilfred Owen calls his poem this and says, bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and toward our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. Right, he has his gas mask on, right? So the misty panes he can barely see, but through the green sea, he sees the man drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. I want to draw your attention that this skillful poet didn't have to rhyme drowning with drowning. He could have easily found other rhymes. He is deliberately repeating the same word to, of course, show how it repeats the vision in his dreams, the vision of the man drowning, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. Again, speaks for itself, but a resounding rejection of the patriotic ideal that most countries educate people, and certainly Owen and his milieu were certainly educated in that ethos in English public schools. They studied Latin, they read these poems in the original Latin. This was very ingrained, and Owen boldly, daringly, I would even say, throws it back in their face, right? In the government's face, in the society's face. No, that's an old lie. If you had seen what I have seen, if you had walked after that wagon and saw that one man drowning in his own lungs because of the poison gas, you would not have repeated that lie to children. Moving back across the channel to Germany, Bertolt Brecht, playwright, famous as a playwright, but also a fantastic poet. And I will here quote only from his poetry, not from his plays. Brecht has a wonderful poem called Questions from a Worker Who Reads. Questions from a Worker Who Reads, translated by Michael Hamburger. And the worker who reads has these questions. Who built Thebes of the Seven Gates? In the books you will find the names of kings. Did the kings haul up the lumps of rock? And Babylon, many times demolished, who raised it up so many times? In what houses of gold-glittering Lima did the builders live? Where, the evening that the wall of China was finished, did the masons go? Great Rome is full of triumphal arches. Who erected them? Over whom did the Caesars triumph? Had Byzantium, much praised in song, only palaces for its inhabitants? Even in fabled Atlantis, the night the ocean engulfed it, the drowning still bawled for their slaves. The young Alexander conquered India. Was he alone? Caesar beat the Gauls. Did he not have even a cook with him? Philip of Spain wept when his armada went down. Was he the only one to weep? Frederick II won the 7 Years' War. Who else won it? Every page a victory. Who cooked the feast for the victors? Every 10 years a great man. Who paid the bill? So many reports, so many questions. Questions Brecht invites us to ask along with this worker. And here's another poem by Brecht, this one translated by H.R. Heiss, and this is more direct. Slave, who is it who shall free you? Those in deepest darkness lying. Comrade, these alone shall see you. They alone can hear you crying. Comrade, only slaves can free you. Everything or nothing, all of us or none. One alone his lot can't better. Choose the gun or fetter. Fetter is chains, right? Everything or nothing, all of us or none. You who hunger, who shall feed you? If it's bread you would be carving, come to us. We too are starving. Come to us and let us lead you. Only hungry men can feed you. Everything or nothing, all of us or none. One alone his lot can't better. Choose the gun or fetter. Everything or nothing, all of us or none. Beaten man, who shall avenge you? You on whom the blows are falling. Hear your wounded brothers calling. Weakness gives us strength to lend you. Comrade, come, we shall avenge you. Everything or nothing, all of us or none. One alone his lot can't better. Choose the gun or fetter. Everything or nothing, all of us or none. Who, O ruined man, shall dare it? He who can no longer bear it. Count the blows that arm his spirit, taught the time by need and sorrow, strikes today and not tomorrow. Everything or nothing, all of us or none. One alone his lot can't better. Choose the gun or fetter. Everything or nothing, all of us or none. Here the chains motif is explicitly based on the Communist Manifesto. This is a communist poem, of course, preaching for joining the struggle, right? Solidarity is the only way, with its use of paradox, right? The hungry man can feed you, etc., etc. And we arrive to back to England. Winston Hugh Auden, who is English but spent time living in Berlin, witnessed the rise of the Third Reich, moved to America and spent decades there. Most of the poetry written, quoted here, was written in the US. And the first one will deal with the partition of India and Pakistan. As you may know, at the end of the British rule over India in 1947, the British, as part of their arrangements to dismantle the British colony, partitioned British India into independent India and independent Pakistan. And this partition had to be the literal partition on the map, right? Drawing the line, where would India end and Pakistan begin? Someone had to do it. And the British governor of India, and also the first governor of independent India, Lord Mountbatten, needed someone to do it. They brought over a judge, a Supreme Court judge from England, to do the job. He was a lawyer. He knew nothing about India. He's never been there. And he was brought over to draw the line on the map and create the partition between these two countries. His name was Cyril John Radcliffe. And this is what Auden has to say about this man. Unbiased, at least, he was when he arrived on his mission. Having never set eyes on the land he was called to partition. Between two peoples, fanatically at odds, with their different diets and incompatible gods. Of course, the partition was based on religion. Pakistan for the Muslims, India for the Hindus. The British ignored the other religions in India. Time, they had briefed him in London, is short. It's too late for mutual reconciliation or rational debate. The only solution now lies in separation. The Viceroy thinks, as you will see from his letter, that the less you are seen in his company, the better. The Viceroy is the governor, right? That's Lord Mountbatten. So we've arranged to provide you with other accommodation. We can give you 4 judges, 2 Muslim and 2 Hindu, to consult with, but the final decision must rest with you. Shut up in a lonely mansion, with police night and day patrolling the gardens to keep the assassins away, he got down to work, to the task of settling the fate of millions. The maps at his disposal were out of date, and the census returns almost certainly incorrect, but there was no time to check them, no time to inspect contested areas. The weather was frightfully hot, and a bout of dysentery kept him constantly on the trot. But in 7 weeks it was done. The frontiers decided, a continent, for better or worse, divided. The next day he sailed for England, where he could quickly forget the case, as a good lawyer must. Return he would not, afraid, as he told his club, that he might get shot. I hope this was easy to follow. I think it's a very interesting reflection by Auden. Auden is not Indian. He's writing this more than almost 20 years. This is from 1966. Almost 20 years after the fact. This isn't a hot take or an immediate response to this happening. So Auden is reflecting on this thing that happened and describing it in surprisingly accurate detail. So all the details here are correct. He did have 4 judges, 2 Muslims, 2 Hindus, etc. I don't know about the being on the trot. Maybe Auden had sources that shared this piece of gossip with him. But everything else is accurate. And I think Auden walks an interesting line here. He describes it as it was, a rush job with out-of-date maps, with no time for reconciliation. The judge, Sir Cyril, was given very little to work with, shut up in a mansion, and the Viceroy wanted to distance himself from the result. It seems like Auden has a lot of sympathy for this impossible task, but at the same time, Auden is condemning the task itself, is condemning this insensitive act of partition affecting millions of lives. People still argue about how many people died as a result of the riots that started immediately upon announcing the partition. Interestingly, by the way, when the partition was decided, the sign was given and independent India and Pakistan were created with indeterminate borders. So the day India was created, the borders were set by Sir Cyril, but not announced. People did not know where the border is for 2 days. And this matters because, as Auden notes, the next day, i.e. before the partition itself was announced, Sir Cyril was already on a boat on the way to England. Just a little historical fact there. Another poem by Auden on a different angle called The Unknown Citizen. This is an older poem from 1939. And Brendan, can we get sound from this computer? I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you in advance. We have Auden reading the poem. Let's see if we can. Maybe it's muted. So,
The Unknown Citizen.
there we go.
To JS 07M378, this marble monument is erected by the state. He was found by the Bureau of Statistics to be one against whom there was no official complaint, and all the reports on his conduct agree that, in the modern sense of an old-fashioned word, he was a saint. For in everything he did, he served the greater community. Except for the war, till the day he retired, he worked in a factory and never got fired, but satisfied his employers, Fudge Motors, Inc. Yet he wasn't a scab or odd in his views, for his union reports that he paid his dues. Our report on his union shows it was sound. And our social psychology workers found that he was popular with his mates and liked to drink. The press are convinced that he bought a paper every day and that his reactions to advertisements were normal in every way. Policies taken out in his name prove that he was fully insured, and his health card shows he was once in hospital but left it cured. Both producers' research and high-grade living declare he was fully sensible to the advantages of the installment plan and had everything necessary to the modern man: a phonograph, a radio, a car, and a frigid air. Our researchers into public opinion are content that he held the proper opinions for the time of year. When there was peace, he was for peace. When there was war, he went. He was married and added 5 children to the population, which our eugenist says was the right number for a parent of his generation. And our teachers report that he never interfered with their education. Was he free? Was he happy? The question is absurd. Had anything been wrong, we should certainly have heard.
Yes.
The Unknown Citizen by W.A. Jordan.
No. There we go. Yes, so that was a treat, listening to the poem read by Auden. It's always interesting to hear poets reading their own poem. So this is a very different tone. This is satire. Auden is pretending or speaking from the throats of the powers that be, the state, right? So if you've noticed, the poem is actually pretending to be an inscription on a marble monument erected by the state to the unknown citizen. This is, of course, an allusion to the monuments to the unknown soldier, right? So the unknown citizen, some society that Auden is imagining in the future, perhaps the near future, is choosing to erect a monument to JS07M378, the unknown citizen. And on the monument, where monuments to unknown soldiers would praise their bravery, the glory of having died for their country, etc. On this monument, we have this kind of dry, bureaucratic summary of the unknown citizen's life. The title itself is ironic, of course, because he is quite known, as we see from the from this dossier, right? He's tracked and measured, and this is written in 1939, so before today, when we really are tracked and measured in all these ways. He lists the various government and society authorities and their assessments of this citizen, in all of which he is found to be adequate, average, compliant, does as he's told, paying his dues, like to drink, you know, one of us, one of them. Of course, the striking, where was it? The striking line: when there was peace, he was for peace. When there was war, he went. I think a genius line, right? He doesn't say when there was war, he was for war, as we might have expected. Nope. When there was peace, he was for peace, as everyone is. When there was war, there is no opinion. He went, as society expects the citizen to do. He was reproducing, right? We have our eugenist. Today we would say eugenicist, right? Eugenics. So the state eugenist says that it was the right number for a parent of his generation. And importantly, the teachers report that he never interfered with their education, meaning the state's education. So this is a model citizen, not interfering with the indoctrination practiced by the state. And ending this satire, was he free? Was he happy? The question is absurd. Had anything been wrong, we should certainly have heard. We, the state, should certainly have heard. By the way, this is written before 1984, in case this reminds you of it. One more Auden, like I said, a very political poet. This one is called The Shield of Achilles, and I need to provide a brief preface for those not familiar with the Shield of Achilles. In the Iliad by Homer, the Greek hero Achilles lends his shield and armor to his friend Patroclus, who goes to fight when Achilles is refusing to fight. Long story short, Patroclus gets killed, and Achilles, enraged and saddened and grieving for Patroclus's death, finally decides to enter the fray, to join the war. And he doesn't have an armor, though, or weapons. He cannot quite do that. To borrow a regular sword from some random soldier is unthinkable for a hero and a king. Achilles is a king. And so he turns to his mother, as great heroes always do. He turns to his mother, who is a goddess, and says, what am I going to do? I don't have an armor. His mother says, don't cry, everything will be okay. Mommy will get you some armor. And she goes to the god Hephaestus, the blacksmith god, and explains the situation and begs that Hephaestus make Achilles a beautiful suit of armor and weapons worthy of Achilles. And Hephaestus does, and fashions the most elaborate, amazing armor, sword, and shield. And the shield in particular gets a very detailed description by Homer over a couple of 100 lines in the original Homeric epic that basically describes the decorations on the shield, and they are so detailed and rich that there's a whole story being told just by gradually exploring the different scenes painted on the shield. Auden is referring to that moment in the Homeric epic where the shield is being described scene by scene, and he's offering us a contemporary, he wrote this in 1952, a contemporary shield of Achilles. Now, the Homeric shield contains, in stark contrast to the war and the bloodshed, the shield of Achilles shows scenes of farming, of raising livestock, scenes of peace and society. This is what Auden tells us is seen on the shield of Achilles. And once again, we have an audio actually, of Auden reading it. So we will let Auden read it and follow along with the text. Brendan, can you do that?
She looked over his shoulder for vines and olive trees, marble well-governed cities and ships upon untamed seas. But there on the shining metal his hands had put instead an artificial wilderness and a sky like lead. A plain without a feature, bare and brown, no blade of grass, no sign of neighborhood, nothing to eat and nowhere to sit down. Yet congregated on its blankness stood an unintelligible multitude. A million eyes, a million boots in line, without expression, waiting for a sign. Out of the air a voice without a face proved by statistics that some cause was just, in tones as dry and level as the place. No one was cheered, and nothing was discussed. Column by column in a cloud of dust, they marched away, enduring a belief whose logic brought them somewhere else to grief. She looked over his shoulder for ritual pieties, white flower-garlanded heifers, libation and sacrifice. But there on the shining metal where the altar should have been, she saw by his flickering forge light quite another scene. Barbed wire enclosed an arbitrary spot where bored officials lounged, one cracked a joke, and sentries sweated for the day was hot. A crowd of ordinary decent folk watched from without and neither moved nor spoke, as three pale figures were led forth and bound to three posts driven upright in the ground. The mass and majesty of this world, all that carries weight and always weighs the same, lay in the hands of others. They were small and could not hope for help, and no help came. What their foes liked to do was done. Their shame was all the worst could wish. They lost their pride and died as men before their bodies died. She looked over his shoulder for athletes at their games, men and women in a dance, moving their sweet limbs, quick, quick to music. But there on the shining shield, his hands had set no dancing floor, but a weed-choked field. A ragged urchin, aimless and alone, loitered about that vacancy. A bird flew up to safety from his well-aimed stone. That girls are raped, that two boys knife a third, were axioms to him, who had never heard of any world where promises were kept, or one could weep because another wept. The thin-lipped armourer, Hephaestus, hobbled away. Thetis of the shining breasts cried out in dismay at what the god had wrought to please her son, the strong, iron-hearted, man-slaying Achilles, who would not live long.
Thank you, Auden. Yes. So, a very powerful. I mean, like Owen's invocation of the classic, the schoolboy material, dulce et decorum est, right, which every educated man of his generation knew. Auden likewise invokes Homer, which again every educated man of Auden's generation also knew, but transforms it completely. And at the end, in this section here, he explains why, right? So Thetis, in a strange time warpy way, knows what to expect, even as the blacksmith is working on the shield, right? She's hoping to see dancers and athletes, etc., and keeps being disappointed. And at the end of the poem, he explains to us why is Hephaestus not putting on what we would expect, what we know from Homer to expect. It is because that girls are raped and boys knife a third were axioms to him. He doesn't know. He's painting or decorating the shield with the world as he sees it, as Hephaestus sees it, and that's the world he knows. He doesn't know a world where promises are kept, or a world where there is sympathy, where one could weep because another wept. That's it. He walks away. Thetis, that's Achilles' mum. Thetis of the shining breasts. And of course, the connection to Achilles, Auden doesn't miss that, to end it by saying, well, this is the fitting shield. Remember, the Thetis went to Hephaestus to get Achilles a fitting armor, something worthy of Achilles. Well, this, says Auden, is what is fitting to the man-slaying Achilles, to that god of war, Achilles, who would not live long. Of course, we know that as well from the Homeric epic, but Auden is stressing it, reminding us that that is what war gives us: death, and a world where promises are not kept, etc. So Auden, later in life, became rather anxious about political poetry and made this striking statement: Orpheus, who moved stones, is the archetype not of the poet, but of Goebbels. That's the Nazi minister of propaganda. And he says this in a work published in 1948, just after World War II and the Holocaust. Orpheus, for those not up on their Greek mythology, is the musician whose music was so powerful it literally moved rocks when he was playing his harp, and who went to hell to get his love back. So the powerful poet, right, Orpheus who moved stones, is not the archetype of the poet, Auden says, but of Goebbels. He's essentially saying, never mind poetry, the really powerful thing is propaganda, is Goebbels. Speech powerful enough to move stones is dangerous. It leads to Goebbels, it leads to Nazism. A very pessimistic sentiment by Auden. And as an antidote, we will read some Auden. Perhaps one of his more famous poems, September 1st, 1939, interestingly written September 3rd, 1939, literally written in real time. He was in the US, as he says, sitting in one of the dives on 52nd Street. Auden was gay, by the way, and was openly gay, and part of the attraction of the US for him was that at that time in New York, he could be more open about it. Anyway, he is writing this 2 days after Germany invades Poland, before any of the horrors of World War II. And this is strikingly prophetic. This is the poet as prophet. 2 days into the war, of course the US is not part of the war, as we know, at that stage, and 2 days into the war, into the invasion that is elsewhere, that is in Europe, but of course 6 years into the Reich, which I remind you, Auden observed closely, saw the rise to power in the early 30s in Berlin, and is a fluent speaker of German. So based on all of that, 2 days into the war, he writes this: I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid, as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. Waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The unmentionable odor of death offends the September night. Accurate scholarship can unearth the whole offense from Luther until now that has driven a culture mad. Find what occurred at Linz, what huge imago made a psychopathic god. I'll pause here and explain. He's talking about Germans and Germany, right? And he says, I leave it to scholars, right? Accurate scholarship could probably trace the line from Luther, Martin Luther, the Protestant Revolution in the 16th century, until now, that has driven a culture mad, the German culture. Find what occurred at Linz in Austria, that's where Hitler was born. What huge imago, so he's alluding directly to Jungian psychology and a psychologistic explanation for what drives Hitler. Remember, this is, again, September 1939. This isn't Hitler post factum. This is when he's at the peak of his power. What huge imago made a psychopathic god? So that's for scholars to do, Auden says. I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. Exiled Thucydides knew all that a speech can say about democracy and what dictators do. The elderly rubbish they talk to an apathetic grave. Analyzed all in his book, the enlightenment driven away, the habit-forming pain, mismanagement and grief. We must suffer them all again. Thucydides is the Greek historian of the Peloponnesian War, the war between Athens and Sparta. And Thucydides' book is very much worth reading. Even if you're not into military history, you can skip the battle descriptions. I give you permission. But read the speeches. Read the oratory in Thucydides. Thucydides has a wonderful passage where he says, I should have brought it here actually, words have lost their meaning. In a passage that really kind of anticipates Orwell and, war is peace and all that. Thucydides says, justice is considered stupidity. Greed is considered virtue. He reflects, and again, this is in 2,500 years ago. Thucydides reflects how war corrupts everything, corrupts society, corrupts the discourse in society. And Auden knows this very well, has read Thucydides, and weariedly, resignedly, with resignation, says, yes, we must suffer them all again. Again, this is 2 days into the war. Auden already sees all that's going to pass. He sees the flattening of the discourse. He sees the jingoism and empty war drums. He sees all of it and laments it. And reminds us that we should have known better. Thucydides has already taught us this thousands of years ago. Into this neutral air, New York, right? Into this neutral air where blind skyscrapers use their full height to proclaim the strength of collective man, each language pours its vain competitive excuse. But who can live for long in a euphoric dream? Out of the mirror they stare, imperialism's face and the international wrong. A little pun on the international right. Faces along the bar cling to their average day. The lights must never go out, the music must always play. All the conventions conspire to make this fort assume the furniture of home. Lest we should see where we are, lost in a haunted wood, children afraid of the night, who have never been happy or good. This stanza describes life in America as the war begins. After the sensational headlines of September 1st, September 2nd, life immediately goes back to normal. People are at the bar, the music must always play, conventions aspire, as they would, right? As most people, for most Americans, it was something happening elsewhere, right? Auden is special in that he has been to Germany, he speaks German, he saw what happened, and he has stronger reasons to be anxious, and he's also anxious that people around him are not anxious. And he paints, he describes this life going on as a sham, designed to prevent us from seeing what we actually are. The peace, the American peace, the neutrality, to Auden already is a sham. He's already feeling the earth shaking beneath his feet, children afraid of the night. He's seeing what's coming. The windiest militant trash important persons shout is not so crude as our wish. What Mad Nijinsky wrote about Diaghilev is true of the normal heart. For the error bred in the bone of each woman and each man craves what it cannot have, not universal love, but to be loved alone. This requires a little unpacking. This is Auden grappling with guilt, somehow connecting the geopolitical situation, the war, to personal sins or vices. And he says, yes, there's all that militant trash that important persons with ironic capitals shout. Yes, there's all the political propaganda and nonsense, but even that is not as crude as our wish. Our own insides are even cruder. And what is so crude? He alludes to something that was famous at the time. Nijinsky was the greatest ballet dancer of the early 20th century, and his the ballet impresario of the Ballet Russe of the French of the Russian ballet in Paris was Diaghilev, and he was his manager. He discovered him and made him a star, and also was his lover. So they were gay lovers, which is interesting for Auden. And Nijinsky at some point started scribbling in his notebooks feverishly for several weeks, after which he was declared insane, carted off to an asylum, and spent the rest of his days in an asylum. Apparently acute schizophrenia that took hold, but very interestingly, the notebooks of Nijinsky are some of the only examples we have of an intelligent person documenting descending into deep schizophrenia. So because of that, those texts, those notebooks were widely read and interesting to people like Auden. And among other things, Nijinsky is lamenting losing Diaghilev's love. But Auden says this isn't special. What Mad Nijinsky wrote about Diaghilev is true of the normal heart. Perhaps Auden is... we are left to wonder what is the opposition here. What is the non-normal heart? Is he talking about gay love, or is he talking about just less illustrious people, right? Like everyday people. But he claims the error bred in the bone of each woman and each man is that we want what we cannot have. That is the sin. And that we, instead of harboring universal love, right, which is the Christian ideal or the socialist ideal, if you will, instead of harboring universal love, no, we, with our crude hearts, want to be loved alone. We're selfish. We want to be the sole object of love. And when Nijinsky found out that Diaghilev has other young men he's interested in, and his fancy has shifted from Nijinsky to others, Auden hints that's when Nijinsky went mad. So this is kind of a personal little mess that Auden is including in this poem. It's very unpolitical. It's philosophical, if you will. It's moralistic. It's Jungian, whatever. It's kind of a personal thing, a personal interpretation and personal anxieties that Auden is weaving into his otherwise kind of broad political poem. I hope that was more or less clear, this passage. So the error bred in the bone of each woman and each man craves what it cannot have, not universal love, but to be loved alone. From the conservative dark into the ethical life, the dense commuters come, repeating their morning vow. I will be true to the wife. I'll concentrate more on my work. And helpless governors wake to resume their compulsory game. Who can release them now? Who can reach the deaf? Who can speak for the dumb? All I have is a voice to undo the folded lie, the romantic lie in the brain of the sensual man in the street, and the lie of authority whose buildings grope the sky. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die. Again, a very radical sentiment from Auden. He's kind of tying himself into knots over this anxiety, over the war, and culminates in a complete rejection of authority, of the state, and declares this very raw sentiment: no such thing as the state, no one exists alone, hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police, we must love one another or die. Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them, of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. So despite the very dark and desperate vision or interpretation he has of the situation and of society, he notes that even though the world is defenseless in the night, and again, he doesn't know the end, right? The coming end of World War II. He doesn't know Hitler would be beaten. Defenseless under the night, the world in stupor lies. Yet, Auden recognizes there are little dots of light. They are ironic points of light because so few, because so powerless, right? That's the irony, is that in this great despair, nonetheless, ironically, there are some points of light. And these points of light are decent people, right? They flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. And so he says, may I, composed like them, like the just people, of eros and of dust, which is another way of saying eros and thanatos, right? Love and death, sex and death, eros and dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. So he ends with this note of desperate, though, or rather defiant though desperate optimism of, well, things look desperate, things look lost, but let me be an affirming flame. Let me be one of those ironic points of light. I need to try to be one of the just, one of the decent people who provide the ironic counter to the night that the world is under. And in this, he's of course committing to love one another or die, right? To this anarchic Christian/socialist notion to try to practice universal love, to try to love one another and be an affirming flame. So that's a bit of an antidote to Auden's anxiety about political poetry, and we shall end with contemporary political poetry. This poet is Fadi Judah, Palestinian-American poet, and his poem is called Mimesis. Mimesis, as you know, or mimesis, as some would pronounce it, but in Greek, mimesis is imitation. Mimesis is imitation, and Aristotle teaches us in the Poetics that art is mimesis, art is imitation. And so Fadi Judah writes this: my daughter wouldn't hurt a spider that had nested between her bicycle handles. For 2 weeks she waited until it left of its own accord. If you tear down the web, I said, it will simply know this isn't a place to call home, and you'd get to go biking. She said, that's how others become refugees, isn't it? Fadi Judah leaves us with this innocent girl's question. And the final poem for today by a young British poet named Warsan Shire. What they did yesterday afternoon. They set my aunt's house on fire. I cried the way women on TV do, folding at the middle like a 5-pound note. I called the boy who used to love me, tried to okay my voice. I said, hello. He said, Warsan, what's wrong? What's happened? I've been praying, and these are what my prayers look like. Dear God, I come from 2 countries. One is thirsty, the other is on fire. Both need water. Later that night, I held an atlas in my lap, ran my fingers across the whole world, and whispered, "Where does it hurt?" It answered, "Everywhere, everywhere, everywhere." Thank you for your attention. Show an affirming flame. And questions? Are there any questions on the Hangout or just technical? Yeah, fitter, happy. Oh yeah, yes. And that was about the unknown citizen. Yeah. Yes. Any questions, comments?
Asaf, this is Chris. I did have a quick question.
Yeah.
I noticed in many of the poems that throughout all the contexts that were brought to our attention today, that certain occupations seem to keep coming up around priesthood, around the law, lawyers, and things of that nature. In many of these political poems, are people of certain occupations very common?
I'm not sure I understood the question. So the poems mentioned priests and lawyers, and the question is what?
Are these occupations, I guess, generally like very commonly represented, or do they play a major role in these discussions of political poetry?
Right. So as you maybe saw, the early poems, the poems by Heine and Shelley, explicitly mention the clergy and the law. And these later poems by Auden, by these contemporary poets, do not. The reason is that in the early 19th century, literacy was still uncommon, and the law and the church were basically alongside the nobility. They were the classes that had literacy, and doctors had literacy and power, right? Because the aristocrats needed the church and needed the law to rule, to run the country, to deal with parliament, etc. And so that is why it is appropriate to blame them or to share the blame with them. It's not just the king, it's not just God, it's those people. Both Shelley and Heine blame those layers of society because they could have done otherwise, or they could have, at least the poets say they could, right? They could have resisted, they could have not cooperated with the autocrats. This is just less the case in the 20th century and 21st century, so you would see less of that. Does that answer your question?
It does, thanks. It's interesting to see just the different layers of institutions represented in some of the earlier poetry.
Yes, yes, absolutely, and you see that the original poem by Shelley is very direct, right? It's a call to arms. It is pointing directly, telling the commoners, these are your enemies. These are the people you need to hold accountable, and you are many and they are few. Whereas Auden is a lot more pessimistic and sophisticated in his understanding of society, and he doesn't rabble rouse. He doesn't say, go get the politicians. It's far less clear cut. It's far more pessimistic than Shelley's naive, romantic call to arms. Any other questions? No? Okay. Thank you very much. See you next installment of Poetryphobia. Bye-bye.